So, I'm Gavin Clarke, and I work in Advocate with TestStand and Sam. So, as you've already been told, and Jake, yeah. So, yeah, as you've been told, I've certified LabVIEW and TestStand and the Centre of Excellence.
Is that the last one? Copy paste.
You added it after Mattis said.
Well, no. So I'll do just a little presentation on operating interface and communicating it with it from your sequence or your model or plugin or anything. So this was a giant of females. So an Egyptian woman called Hypatia. She was a philosopher and astronomer, and she was into maths, teaching maths and lots of other things. This probably must have been very difficult for being a woman teaching maths in Egypt in those times. So as everyone knows, there are two application instances: the operating interface and the TestStand sequence run in two separate instances, and so you need some way of communicating between them. So there are various different ways. There's network shared variables, TCPIP, ActiveX, reading, writing into file, synchronization objects, and UI messages. So I'm going to concentrate mostly on the synchronization objects and the UI messages. So this is just one of the operating interface that I've developed, starting from a base that PICAS started off on. So the temperature graph that uses the TCPIP communicate with a message broker that communicates with the instruments and pulls in that temperature. There's all the test sockets. So they were from Tom's. It's probably a good follow on from Tom's. We've got all the sub panels and the dividers and all that. So all the socket communications, so the equipment number we have for all our boards is there's a UI message that passes back that to the sequence, to the operating interface. Once it's identified what board it is, along with the board type and lots of other information. And there's lots of other. So in the process model, so you've got when a board, each time a board step fails, it passes details of why it failed to the operating interface. Simplified from the execution tracing view. So the progress bar, the production manufacturing wants to know, because our sequences take a few hours to finish, and so what they ask for is a progress bar so they can estimate when they're likely to finish. And so if there's a shift finishes or they want to go on break, they know roughly when it should finish. So that was added. Also on the status bar, so the status bar as well was I found that was a very useful tool to give indication back to the user. So as you see there's a little blue progress bar there telling it it's generating a HTML test report, which is very useful for the test engineer, test operator, so they know there's something happening, so they don't just press the terminate sequence button. And lots of other information down there. Okay. So to implement the UI messages, so in the operating interface there is a register event callback. So here there's actually the same VI is used for the UI. Well, there's two VI UI messages. There's a user one and there's a TestStand integrated one. But here they're both registered, the same VI gets registered to both of them, so it'll get passed into that. So to pass messages to your operating interface, UI messages are various ways of doing it. So the first way is text. You can just put a string in your one state where post UI messages, and then the name, that's a enum, UI message model state identified. Then the next element is the numeric, in this case the socket, and serial number, and this context. And then you've got the bottom one is synchronous. That's probably the, I don't think I've ever found a reason to have it as false, because if it's asynchronous, especially similar to these last one, when a board part finishes, you want to wait for your operating interface to catch up so you don't get the wrong order of UI messages. So there's also the two examples in that sequence. Also, VI, you've got progress text and percentage progress. And you've got two, one if you've got the thread sequence, sorry, the thread reference, and one if you've got the actual, and if you haven't got, so the other one needs execution and thread from the engine reference. There's also the .NET, so the ActiveX callback as well, action step. So another way, so let's go back to there. So in the simplified results, so if a test fails, it reports back here to the operating interface to say what test failed and a little bit of expected result and what I actually saw. And it also counts, you can barely see that there, but it counts each time a test fails, it counts. So that was achieved with in a process model post-step failure. So this was in the model, batch model. This was one of the changes we made. So every time a step fails, it will call this, and this basically goes through all the types of tests. Case, so if it's a pass-fail, string value, numeric value, so numeric unit test. And it will loop through all of them and print out. You can't see it, but at the bottom there's one UI message that passes that back. Okay. So I do have an example. I was going to show you the VI, but I'll wait for that. I'll do this first and then I'll come back to that. So the other way of communicating with your sequence is actually using a native queue, TestStand queue. And to do that, you need the synchronization manager reference. And then if you create a queue with a star at the beginning of its name and use the TestStand API, you can actually pass elements, queue elements back into the TestStand. You can do that with notifiers, you can do that with all the other synchronization elements. And there's two examples of enqueuing and dequeuing, and even creating a queue that's disabled there. I can't say I've ever used that, but I tested it out and it worked.
So the star is that mandatory?
So that's, to be able to communicate between the operating interface and the TestStand, you have to put the star, and that allows it. So it only works in using the test synchronization manager. You can't create a normal VI native W queue and put a star in front of its name. Doesn't work. And so because so once I saw this somewhere, and then I could never figure out where I found it. So when I did eventually find it, I did make a note where it says. So in the help for the TestStand, it does give you a description of creating that queue and how you can create, so you can communicate between, say, a 64-bit processor and a 32-bit queue between the operating interface and that.
Okay, so it does say that it's, if you want to share it,
Yeah.
then you start with the start. Okay.
Yeah, so it does work, and there is documentation to say it does work as well.
No. I'm yeah. I've never come across that, but yeah.
No, because I did when I was looking for this, I did see a post saying in the early lab you could do this, but then they broke it and stopped it from working. But it was never supposed to work in that way. But
And I would never break anything.
yeah,
Never.
but their reason was it's never supposed to work that way.
And that's the question for your next quiz.
Okay. So so this is another tip as well that I came across, because it's been finding a way to log data from a TestStand to a file has never been easy. It's not. You can usually save it to a report, but so looking through here, I found this. So most of the LabVIEW actually uses this for the underlying code. So this is a Microsoft .NET, and so this is included in every Windows. So it's basically .NET call, and you can write text to a file quite easily by giving it a name and the string. So this is the one that I've shown there is appendable text, but there's lots of just a .NET call to add text to a file.
I've done a similar thing by just using a command line call.
Yeah.
So there's a command line call where you can write to an existing file, create a new file, and write to it. So it just keeps appending.
Yeah, because I did do that, and then I found like file names. If it's like a user-generated file name, then you don't really want to be sending that to a command prompt.
Why not?
Well, the code execution stuff, you can put a string in there that runs a program. But this is easy, not simple.
Yeah, and also I think with these calls, I mean, you get feedback and return and a lot more information back from the thing.
It's also lower level, which means it's if you're basically already with your console on a higher level, there is more in between which can go wrong, which means that your information never gets to your file. And like originally, so this is like a massive improvement of what we had before. Beforehand, we had like kind of like it almost like sitting in the middle of the framework, like above what we call like the message broker, which connects all the different parts of the framework. Which means if anything in the message broker went wrong, the information would never get to this error logger. And this way, Gavin has basically put it really at the lowest level, which means we get every single test and runtime error, which otherwise would have never made it in. So this is really basically it's worth its weight in gold to actually find problems rather than just hunting them for 2 weeks.
Yeah, so this is all modified in process model and the plugins, and added that to the runtime error. Yeah, we can use it anywhere. So I was going to show.
So there's a question which says, is the public token fixed, or does it have to follow a specific syntax?
Oh, I think that's in the .NET code that is fixed.
Yeah, it depends on the version of the .NET, I think. I mean, so and it's really not.
In the second line, culture neutral public key token.
Yeah, you don't have to.
No, you just choose that. I think there's version 2 and a version 4.
It's not actually modifiable headline.
So this is the example VI that receives all the messages from the operating interface. So there's a few of them. So there's one when it terminates to check whether it's terminate all or whether it's terminate. Just funny things happen when you do a terminate all, so it just passes the stops everything running when it receives a terminate all. There is progress bar as well. So this wasn't, I'd have thought this would be implemented, but it wasn't. So it basically just takes so the inputs there is all the progress bar. It takes the 0 to 100 progress. Otherwise, errors.
So why does it have to be converted into a variant and then back into numeric? Oh, there are other things in the
this is over
Sorry, no.
strings. The text is file names. That's on that. So most of when it calls, you get the reference, and you get ActiveX data. You get numeric string in the event, and the threads, and the synchronizer, whether it's synchronized or not. I only added them there. They are used mostly inside the. So the various messages you get, most of the messages are either in the model or in your plugins, or there's a model helper, and all these various places in there have all these messages, and they give the required information at the right time. And there's usually extra information that is passed. And most of the time you get this context reference is the ActiveX data. Okay. Yeah, so most of the time that's this context, so you get so you can read and write. And so that's the other reason for synchronization. If it's synchronization, you can communicate backwards and forwards, because most of the time you want to do the sequence in charge, and so it requests data or pushes data rather than the operating interface pulling it from the sequence. And so the synchronous wait till it's finished, and then it will move on to the next, so you grab the data at that point in time. So once the process model has identified what the product is, it sends this message, and the part number is in the process model, and that just updates the socket and enables this test socket. You've got begin testing. You've got testing complete. You've got enable state. So when you select your test sockets, you can disable and enable them. And each time you enable or disable them, you get this message: enable state set. And if it's true, it sends nothing. If it's false, it sends a disable socket message to the actual socket. An error logger. Whenever an error happens, you get this error, runtime error callback. So it saves the error back to the file. And then, so you also got anything over the 10,000 is a user message. So these were used for updating the test details of the sockets. So if it's 10,101 is the current name of the test. If it's 10,102, it's a log failure or an error on 10,130. There's another message. Okay. Also another message to get the UI version. And so also the next thing is the progress bar. I have a plugin that sends a message when it starts. The sequence starts to say I've started, and each time it runs, there's a little MySQL lookup that reads previously run boards and pull out an average time of the previous boards and say, okay, then the last 3 boards took this long, and so it passes that message back to the operator interface and update the progress bar. So the form level is the estimated time of, and also update the estimated time of completion. It also adds on the time that's already. So in a sequence, so we have a batch model, but you might be, say, 20, 30 seconds into that, until you find out what type of operation it is. So for the report, there's various entries. So there's one that so in the background, the plugin is looking for an operation variable to change. If it changes, it reads that back and says, okay, then, so this is the operation I'm doing. So it might be temperature test, it might be bring up. And so each of those operations will have a different estimated test time. So I'll do that lookup and pass it back to the operating interface and add on the time up to that point onto it. Take that away from the current time. You've got to stop and a reset to default.
So that's something that's being requested by production, isn't it?
Yeah. They've been asking for it for probably years.
So I think, yeah, the problem basically has been that the testers often doesn't seem to be doing anything for a very long time. For example, if you have a very thorough memory test going on, that can take half an hour. And so they are not like sure, like, right, okay, has this crashed now? Or is it still running? And just seems to be the longer this time goes on, the bigger the terminate button seems to get. We haven't found out why that is, but it just seems to be growing until it's the whole screen. And they just like, yeah, and they just push it. So this seems to have fixed that bug that the terminate button is growing. And at least it only starts growing now from the point where it's actually over the estimated time of completion. That's when it now starts to grow.
Yeah, it's a good example of providing feedback to the user, because if you have something where you provide no feedback and it just stays, then they don't know what's going on, and that's not good. Especially if you're transitioning people from who were used to running things manually and used to running scripts and stuff on a terminal. They're not used to just sitting there and then nothing happening on a screen. So you need to give them some feedback to keep them happy. And that's some of the experience that we've had anyway.
Yeah, I think, so to give a bit of background, when basically our team started like 4 years ago, all testing on the shop floor has been done manually. So this is like a low volume, high value industry. So which means they basically were then opening up Terraterm or Putty, opening like the COM port, were then typing in the commands, manually actuating the power supply, and basically running through the test, looking like, has this passed? Oh yes, I can move on, and that type of stuff. And we've taken that all away and made it a one-button approach, and all of a sudden they don't have this feedback from the console anymore. And that's kind of where a lot of the confusion stems from.
Yeah, because we used to have the execution tracing window open, and that they didn't like that. That gave them too much information, so they could sit there and just watch it. So it was cut down.
Yeah, I mean, if you think Game of Thrones was exciting, this seems to be so much more exciting.
Okay, any questions?
Nothing on that. Thanks very much.